Hello friends, this is Shayla with Shayla G Photography, and I am back with another lesson on how to use your fancy camera to take really beautiful photos. In our last episode, we had a lesson on how to adjust your aperture to get that creamy, dreamy background that makes your subject pop. If you haven't watched that episode, please make sure you watch that because we are going to start pulling things together and you are going to learn to use your camera in manual very soon. Today, we are going to learn about shutter speed. Along with aperture, it is another piece of the exposure triangle that allows us some creative control over our images. As part of the exposure triangle, it allows us to manage the amount of light that reaches the camera's sensor when we're taking that picture. As a creative control, it allows us the choice between freezing motion or capturing movement. The shutter is two curtains over the sensor of the camera. When you click the button on your camera, the bottom shutter drops, exposing the sensor to light, and after whatever amount of time you've set for your shutter speed, the top curtain drops and ends the exposure of the sensor to light. This amount of time is indicated as fractions of a second. So when you're setting your dial, you'll see like a 1/60, and that means that is 1/60th of a second. If it's a whole number, like 1.0, that indicates that the shutter will be open and exposed to light for a full second. It can be even longer than that full second, depending on what you're doing. So it can be 1.6, 2.0, etc. There's more to explain about the shutter speed and how it affects the creative control of your images and how it affects the exposure triangle and the length of time that your sensor is exposed to light. But I'd really rather get on to the practical practice and get you some hands-on experience so you understand in a practical manner what this means to you when you're taking photos. Let's look at our camera mode dials. Again, you can tell by the little white mark there that my dial is on auto. We want to turn that to shutter speed priority, which on my Sony is indicated by the letter S. On your camera, it may be an S, or it may be a TV like television, or it may be something different. You might need to consult Google or your owner's manual to find out what shutter speed is on your dial. So for our exercise, we are going to find something that is moving. We're going to snap a couple pictures of it at different shutter speeds. So you can see in orange that my shutter speed is changing. This may also change other numbers on your camera as you cycle through. We're not worried about that. We are going to do this where we have a fair amount of light, again, just like when we did our aperture priority, so that our camera has the ability to do what it needs to do to compensate for our changing shutter speed.
All right, we are at the fountain in my neighborhood, and I thought this would be a good chance to see what a freezing of motion looks like with water and what blurring of motion looks like with water. So I'm going to take two different photos with the camera and we will compare them side by side to see what we get.
So pro tip, you've got to take off those polarized sunglasses. I could not see the screen of the camera at all with them on. All right, so you can see that I'm set up with a tripod. This is because we all have a little bit of shake in our hands, which affects the pictures with longer exposures. A general guideline is that for any photos taken at shutter speeds below 1/60th of a second, you may want to use a tripod or set the camera on something stable so that you eliminate any of that hand movement from showing up in your image. You can see it's a really nice sunny day here, so I can use a pretty high shutter speed. I think in my intro there I said I was going to take 2 pictures. I actually ended up taking 3 because I felt like we could get an even better comparison. So the fastest shutter speed I'm using here is 1/640th of a second. I'm going to make sure that I nail focus on that fountain and snap my picture. And then I'm going to adjust my dial down to a slower shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. Again, I'm going to need to make sure that I am catching focus on that fountain and taking my second picture. Then finally, I am going to use the slowest shutter speed for this exercise of 1/13th of a second. Again, make sure that you capture focus and then snap the picture. And then we will compare our results and see what we get. Okay, now we get to see our experiment side by side. The fastest shutter speed is on the left and the slowest is on the right. But I want to kind of zoom in so that you can see individually. At the 1/640th of a second, you can see little round droplets of water, which means we have frozen each of those drops of water for that moment in time. And it's very much about the individual drop's journey. In the medium exposure, the 1/30th of a second, you can see more of a path that each droplet is taking. So it's not entirely smooth, but you're not seeing individual drops. In our slowest exposure, the 1/13th of a second, it's very smooth. You're seeing the story of the entire fountain and the arc the water makes as it leaves the fountain and goes to the pond. It's not about the individual drop here. Okay, so another thing I wanted to show you is the Ferris wheel in motion. So we'll do one at a fast shutter speed where we freeze it, and then we'll do one at a slower shutter speed where you can see the movement of the Ferris wheel. And we may have to wait a second for it to get moving, but give me a second and we'll get that taken. You can probably tell by looking at the beautiful sunset colors of the sky that this filming was being done toward the end of the day. Partly that's because that's the time of day I had available to do it, but it also makes for a really compelling image because you can better see the lights on the Ferris wheel up against that darker sky. Once again, I'm set up on a tripod. This, like the other exercise, is to minimize the introduction of handshake to the camera. Then that's even more important in lower light situations such as this. And just like our previous exercise, I also ended up taking 3 different images of the Ferris wheel after all. The first one, the fastest shutter speed I used was 1/320th of a second. The second image I took was at 1/3 of a second, and the final was at 1 full second. Again, you need to make sure that you catch focus on your image to get the best quality image and have the best idea of what shutter speed will do with a moving Ferris wheel. Let's look. Once again, we're looking at our images side by side. The fastest shutter speed is on the left and the slowest is on the right. I'm sure you're already noticing some differences, but I'd like to go through them one by one to really talk about them. At our fastest shutter speed, we have a very crisp, clear image. You can see the spokes on the Ferris wheel really clearly. You can see the individual cars very clearly, and the word sky wheel is very clear. We have succeeded in freezing motion. At 1/3 of a second, we're starting to see the blur where we've captured the motion. You can see that the lights of the spokes are blurring and that the cars are not so crisp and clear. And then when we slow the shutter speed down to our slowest speed of 1 full second, we're seeing quite a bit of motion blur. The spokes are not very clear at all, and you're seeing the trail of the cars. They're kind of very fuzzy dots. But we are seeing a very clear word sky wheel. Now that's because we used the tripod and the word sky wheel is not moving. If we hadn't used the tripod, that would also be blurry from our handshake. When I finished up filming the Ferris wheel experiment, I walked down on the beach just for fun and noticed that the water coming up on the shore was actually a really good opportunity to explore shutter speed as well. So I set down my camera on the tripod and took a couple images there. You can see at 1/250th of a second that the water has definition, and that if you zoomed into the people on the pier, you could see them clearly. You could count how many people are up there. And at 2.5 seconds, the water has a very smooth look to it. And if you zoom into the people on the pier, they are blurry. You may not be able to count them. But the pier itself is sharp and in focus, and that's because I used my tripod. Y'all, I could not stop with this exercise. As soon as I turned around from the water, I could see an even more beautiful view of the sky wheel. So I stuck my tripod down in the sand and snapped a couple more pictures. And the first one you can see at 1/250th of a second is pretty sharp and clear. We again succeeded in freezing motion on that one. But the one I took at 1.0 seconds is showing the motion blur of the Ferris wheel turning. But I also want to point out with this one that my tripod was shifting a little bit in the sand, so you can see that the word sky wheel is not clear and that there's also some motion blur in the skyline and with the trees where I moved the camera. At this point, hopefully your creative juices are flowing. I'd like you to really start thinking about ways that you can practice taking pictures with different shutter speeds to either show motion or freeze motion. Feel free to use similar examples to what I used. You could flip a bicycle upside down on the seat and handlebars and spin the wheel and take different pictures of it, similar to the Ferris wheel experiment that we did. You could take a picture of a flag out flapping in the breeze. You could set your faucet to a fast drip and experiment with faster and slower shutter speeds to see what it does with those. Keep in mind that the speed of the moving object will play a role in what shutter speed you're going to need to choose in order to get the effect you want. So if something is moving faster, you may need to set your shutter speed to a faster amount of time in order to freeze that motion. If something is moving more slowly and you're trying to capture motion, you're going to need an even slower shutter speed. A more advanced method of capturing motion in photography would be panning. So this is something you could try if your kid is out riding their scooter past you. You could handhold the camera, use a slower shutter speed, and try to match the speed of the camera, moving it with the pace of your subject. You want to try to focus on that subject as much as possible the whole time. The goal is to get a mostly in focus subject, although that's very tricky, and the blurred background so that you show that they're moving through the background. It's a really fun thing to try. It is hard to nail, or at least that's been my experience, but I think it's really worth the practice. Now let's go over some guidelines for shutter speed in different situations. The general rule to minimize handshake when you are hand holding your camera to take an image is to set the shutter speed at 1 over the focal length of the lens or 1 over 60, whichever is faster. Let's use my camera with the lens I have on it right now as an example. If I zoom my lens all the way out to 75 millimeters, the slowest shutter speed I would want to use is 1/75th of a second, and that would minimize any handshake that's introduced during the taking of the picture. On the flip side, if I zoom it all the way in to 28 millimeters and I set my shutter speed at 1/28th of a second, I'm probably going to have some shake because that's a pretty slow shutter speed. So in that instance, the slowest I would want to go is 1/60th of a second. If you're photographing sports or something very fast moving and you want to freeze motion, like you want to freeze your kid swinging a bat at a very fast moving ball, something like 1 over 2500ths of a second is what you'll need to freeze that motion. When we're talking about general photos, something where there may be some movement, like walking, but it's nothing that's particularly fast, and you're looking to get crisp, clear photos that don't show a lot of motion, then 1/250th of a second is a really good place to be. And the final guideline that I'd like to talk about today is for long exposures, also known as slow shutter speeds. I've mentioned already that when you're using a slower shutter speed, you may want to set your camera up on a tripod or on a stable surface, and this will keep any handshake that you have from interfering with what you're trying to capture with your camera. Another thing that you may want to take note of is that when you push the button to take your picture, there will naturally be some movement in the camera. If you want to eliminate that movement, you could use a remote to take the picture, or you could set up the timer. Cameras tend to have a 3 or 10-second delay timer on them, and then when you push the button, the camera has a moment to recover from the movement before it takes the picture. All right, friends, that is all I have for you today. I want to encourage you to grab your camera and get out there and practice putting your camera in shutter speed priority and taking pictures of moving objects at faster shutter speeds and at slower shutter speeds and at even slower shutter speeds, just to see what happens and to see what you like. The best way to get better at taking pictures is to practice. And I also want to encourage you that sometimes we get out there and we take a picture and we get lucky and that first one is a great one, but most of the time we have to take a lot of bad photos before we get to the really good photos. So get out there and take a lot of bad photos so we can get to the really good ones. As always, please subscribe and hit the bell to get notified of future episodes, and I appreciate you. Have a great day.